Hi, folks. My name is Joe Mull, and I'm the author of Employalty: How to Ignite Commitment and Keep Top Talent in the New Age of Work. And the best advice I ever got, profanity warning ahead, don't shit where you eat.
Don't shit where you eat. So, did you get that from your parents or a teacher? Who gave you that, Joe? That's great advice.
My very first job that I had out of college was working at a university in the Midwest. And we had this older assistant director in our department. He was on the backside of his career and he was a little persnickety, but he was brilliant. And he would always drop these little nuggets of wisdom to those of us who were just entering the field. And I remember when we were getting all ready to go to a conference. It's a lot of young people. It's a lot of hormones. People like to stay up late and have a good time. And he could have given us a whole speech about that. Instead, right before we left, he said, listen, you're going to a professional conference where you're going to start building connections that could influence the rest of your life. Don't shit where you eat.
Ooh. Well, that sounds like an NSA conference to me, Joe. I don't know.
Not anymore. It's not like that anymore.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, but but it's interesting though that it could be just as applicable though there, right? Where you're hanging out with people that are high flyers that you look up to, that you aspire to be like. You should absolutely bring your A game and save the drinking for when you're home, or save the crazy stuff for when you're home, because otherwise, right? People are gonna be like, yeah, well, I'd like to refer Phil, but
That's right.
I'm not sure I can trust him. Is that kind of
And
what happened?
absolutely, it even goes as far as just thinking about not conducting yourself in any way that could damage the trajectory of your professional life, where you want to go. Maybe that's how you interact with people in the office. Maybe it's what you post online on social media. There's so much that it gets tied to that very short, but I think powerful piece of advice.
Yeah, totally, totally. Well, I think with that, right, he might have been a one of those great bosses to work for. By the way, congratulations. It's your book is my favorite color. Of course, it's a nice orange, so that
Thank you,
makes
brother.
me super happy. And it's got flappies here, which I love. So he's got double bookmarks here. So if you don't have a copy of Employalty, you will by the time that we finish, because this book
Mm.
is freaking awesome. So as we start, Joe, first, how do you define employalty? What the heck is this? Because you kind of made up the word, dude. I looked in the dictionary, I could not
Yep.
find it.
Yep, made it up in an effort to translate the complex into something simple. And we are playing a little bit of a trick on our readers here, because you hear the word employalty and you think, okay, that must be employee loyalty. But actually, it's a portmanteau of the words employer loyalty and humanity. Employalty is the commitment that employers make to a more humane employee experience, because that's what triggers commitment at work. And that is what employees, workers in really every industry across the board, are looking for right now at this moment.
I love that. I agree with that. And I have to say, your use of portmanteau, you said what, your sixth grade or eighth grade teacher
Yeah,
in
my
the
eighth grade
book? I
teacher is
saw the
going to be
footnote.
really
Eighth grade.
proud, right?
Yeah, yeah. Mrs. Game would be proud of me too. She was my freshman English teacher. She would call those 50-cent words.
Yes,
She'd
yes. Well,
say,
I originally called
yeah,
called it employalty a Frankenword, and our good
ooh,
friend Bruce Turkel said it's a portmanteau, Joe. And I knew the word, but I feel like if Bruce Turkel's out in the world dropping words like portmanteau, I got to up my game and use it too.
well, he does drive a Porsche. So, we're not surprised that our friend
Shout out
Bruce
to
would use
Bruce.
the word, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay, so humanity though, Joe, that's an
Mhm.
interesting word. And that's a word that we can't toss around lightly here. I think employers for too long have taken advantage of
Mhm.
employees and forgotten the humanity, right? Work-life balance. I'll tell you, Joe, this wonderful iPhone is an electronic leash. It is
Yes.
not. It's not what's promised. I remember when I got my first BlackBerry in 2006, 2005, something like that. I
Mm.
got a BlackBerry, and we're told, hey, you get a BlackBerry, so that way you can actually leave work a little bit early, and if it's urgent, we'll let you know.
We can
Well,
get
that
in
thing,
touch with
yeah,
you. Yeah.
yeah, which means I'm never gonna stop bugging you, and that's not really humane, is it, Joe?
It's not, and when we talk in this book about a more humane employee experience, we're really getting at a whole system of policies and procedures and ways of doing business that perpetuates suffering to workers that we've come to just sort of accept as the way that you do business. We talk about dehumanization really as any system or policy or structure that does harm to employees' lives outside of work. And there's so many things that we've come to accept in the workplace now that fit this description. So if you think about working in restaurants or retail locations, a lot of those folks don't get their schedule for next week until the end of this week. That's inhumane. How am I supposed to live a life outside of work? How am I supposed to manage my kids' soccer calendar or be the primary caregiver to an elderly parent if I don't know when I'm going to work? Or, for example, telling people that they can only go to the bathroom at a certain time of day, right? That's inhumane. And these inhumanities are often reserved for folks who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. Can you imagine telling an accountant that they have to ask permission to go to the bathroom, or that they have to stand all day while doing their work? So there are certain sorts of approaches that we've had to work for the longest time that treat people not as a fully formed human being, but as a commodity. And anytime you have an employer or a supervisor who acts in a way that disregards the suffering that policies and procedures and systems inflict on workers in their lives outside of work, that's dehumanization.
Wow. So, human capital, right? That's the department we should be worried about here. I have to tell you, I read in the book that you don't like that word either.
Right.
And I'm like, thank you, Joe. So, human capital, why is that so nasty?
Well, it goes to this dehumanization concept, right? The labels that we use to talk about people on our teams, they convey to us how we view them. I still, as a speaker and as a trainer, will go into organizations or conferences and hear every day from leaders who say, yeah, we've got somebody in our firm or in our practice who doesn't know everybody's name, and they don't think they should have to worry about that. They have too many other important things to worry about. Well, listen, when you don't think it's necessary to even know the person's name that you walk past in the hallway every day, or who works on your team, who literally comes to work to support what you're doing every day, you are not able to access their humanity. And when we do not see people as fully formed human beings, when we only look at them through the lens of their tasks and duties, or the ways in which they support us, we commoditize them, and we end up mistreating them, even if it's in a way that's unconscious.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's why I hate the term human capital. It's garbage. So let's never use it again.
Good. It's done. I won't use it again either, Joe. So I love that.
Well, I
that.
wasn't meaning you, my friend. I was
okay.
meaning let's us collectively as a society.
The royal us, right? Yeah. No, love that. So dehumanization is bad. You talk in chapter 4 about rehumanization and the myth of lazy, which I think is super important. So let's just get it out of the way, right? Millennials are lazy, right, Joe?
Yeah, we like that story, don't we? And one of the things that, again, as we try to resist oversimplified generalizations that are not rooted in fact, the idea that the generation coming in the door behind you has a lower work ethic or a lesser set of values than you did at the same age is total bunk, right? And I hate to break it to anybody. I'm 46. Anybody my age and above, the complaints you have about the workers coming in behind you are the exact same complaints that the people ahead of you had when you showed up. What's different now is not necessarily people's values, it's their timing. Think about what we've been telling Gen Z workers for the last couple of years. If you're a parent or you have nieces or nephews, what have you been saying to these folks? You've been saying, hey, you spend most of your waking hours at work, you better do something you like. Hey, bad bosses are a dime a dozen. If you find a good one, don't leave. Hey, when you get a job offer, you better ask for more coming through the door because you're not going to get it after you get there. Well, guess what, Phil? They've been listening. And now they're doing all of the things that we as Gen Xers and baby boomers, it took us a couple of years to recognize that we should be doing for ourselves.
And it's almost like it was unspoken. We didn't think anybody was actually listening, but they sure were. I mean, really, right? I remember thinking years ago, like, oh, I don't ever want to tell anybody what my salary is. That's like a secret. And then I watched, David Burkus out there saying, The myth of salary secrets is, you should be talking about that. And then you think about it, well, of course we should be, because frankly, right, we all should get as much as we deserve, not have to worry about our negotiation skills, right?
Right. That's right. And, you brought up the myth of lazy, which we wrote about in the book as this idea that, uh, people don't want to work anymore. You've heard this, you've seen it on signs posted on businesses. I have a local small business owner in my community who constantly posts in the community Facebook group, "Help me find good people. No one wants to work anymore." Then he posts the hours and the pay. And it's been really interesting to watch members of the community come back and say, "Hold on, time out. It's not that nobody wants to work anymore. It's that nobody wants to work for you because we can't afford to." Right? We really want this to be the story. We want the story to be when we can't find people to come take our jobs, the problem is the people. When the problem is our jobs, right? What's happening right now is not a staffing shortage. It's a great jobs shortage. And we know that's the case. We have the numbers to prove it. Unemployment right now is at 3.4% in the US. It's historically low. Phil, if you took every unemployed person in the United States right now and you put them in the job, we would still have 5 million unfilled jobs tomorrow. There's a researcher in Canada who found this sentiment of no one wants to work in North American newspapers going back 120 years. It's a biased generational trope, and it's not supported by data. There is no invisible mass of people sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah, I saw that. I can't remember if it was you or who it was that posted that, but I saw all the research that goes back. It's like, wow, that's so interesting. It's like the capitalists are trying to, herd their cattle and trying to get us to believe that we should be doing more when in fact we're probably already producing more. And you talk about actually we should work less in the book. So is that less hours or less hard or less both?
It's not less hard, right? People are willing to do hard things. And that's the thing we have to be careful about in a conversation about quote unquote less work. But here's what we know. We know that if you can think back to prior to the pandemic, right? I know it's hard to remember life pre-COVID, but burnout was at an all-time high in the workforce before we ever had a global pandemic. We were working more hours a week than every other developed nation on earth and taking fewer vacation days than every other industrialized nation on the planet. At the same time, burnout was skyrocketing and workloads were too. We know people were getting, managers especially, have seen their workloads explode by more than 30% in just the past 10 years. And so as workloads have gone up, as wages have remained stagnant, people have ended up saying, "I do not want to keep living like this anymore." And they've started to look for new opportunities, new ways to engage with work that's a better quality of life. Basically, when you run an engine at redlining RPMs for years, it's eventually going to give out. Maybe what we should do is run the engine at 80% capacity most of the time so that if there is a moment when we need to punch the gas and get a little bit more, we have it there to give and we haven't broken the engine. That's how we need to think about our workforce. We need to stop operating at minimum staffing thresholds because that goes out the window when somebody decides they want to take a day off, or you have somebody who has an FMLA emergency or wants to go on vacation. And when we look at the impact that workloads have had, just like you said with the cell phones, Phil, it's encroached on every corner of our lives. People generally do a great job when they believe they have a great job. And if my job really negatively impacts my ability to do all the other things in my life that are important to me, that's not a great job. And that's a big part of what people are pushing back against.
Definitely. Definitely. Well, our friend Patrick Donadio chimes in with work smarter, not
Patrick.
harder. That's interesting though. And I would say, work hard, but work less, right? Don't try to work 60, 70 hours. And I don't know, but that whole productivity thing, I'm not sure that I buy that any longer. I used to for sure. I don't know, Joe, what do you think?
Well, this is one of the reasons why you're seeing initiatives like 4-day work weeks gain so much traction in places where they're doing pilot programs and trials. And there have been a lot more of them overseas than there have been here in the States, but they are happening here in the States too. And consistently, what we see is when you have a 4-day work week, you're not trying to shove 40 hours into 4 days. It's actually a reduction in hours. In most 4-day work week trials that have had a lot of success, you're seeing about 35 or 36 hours a week at full salary and benefits. And it's surprising to learn, but your employees can actually get as much, sometimes even more done in a 4-day, 35-hour work week than in a 5-day work week. And there are a couple of reasons why. The first is, yes, we end up working a little bit smarter. There's a kind of trimming of the fat that takes place when you need to be a more efficient with your time. Are these meetings necessary? Is this commute necessary? How do we get crystal clear on the way that performance is going to be measured and productivity is going to be measured? The other thing that happens is that people's quality of life improves and they end up having more time at home, less time in a commute, less expense for commutes, for lunches at work, things like that, that their commitment goes up. So you do end up working smarter and better, but you've also given a quality of life enhancement to people that comes back to you in terms of the level of commitment that they bring to the work.
Wow. So by shaving off half a day, 4 hours, if you will, but giving them a full day, that might be one way, if you can't pay more, that you could potentially get as much or more out of your people. Is that right?
That's right. And, if you think about not just the impact that this has on the workplace, where we do see productivity go up, we do see retention go up, we do see commitment go up, we also hear from employees that their quality of life improves. They report lower stress, lesser burnout, more time to run errands. They're taking better care of themselves. They have more time for exercise, for sleep, for cooking healthy meals. By and large, they report that those quality of life enhancements actually translate into being a better employee, being sharper, being more attentive, being more dedicated at work.
And that is what we all want. So that's pretty awesome. Well, let's dive into your Employalty scorecard here. I
Yeah.
love that you've got 3 parts here. You've mentioned this great boss a couple of times. We'll talk about that. You've got the ideal job and the meaningful work. So which one do you want to start with, Joe? I'm gonna make this the blackjack player's choice here. What do you pick?
So in the book, we have this very simple one sentence answer to the question, which is, where does commitment come from at work? And this is the work I've been doing for years, and teaching leaders how to be better bosses and create the conditions at work for people to thrive. And I decided that I wanted to be able to advise leaders and business owners on what they need to focus on in a single sentence, right? Because we don't serve business owners and executives and leaders well if it feels like you have to memorize an absolute encyclopedia of information about all the things we need to pay attention to in those roles. And so we married together a lot of the social science research and employee engagement and the psychology of motivation with what's happening in the labor market right now, what people are looking for in a post-COVID world. And so the one sentence answer to the question, where does commitment come from at work, is commitment and retention appear when employees are in their ideal job doing meaningful work for a great boss. Let's start with ideal job. Ideal job has 3 dimensions to it: compensation, workload, and flexibility. When you get my money right, when my workload is reasonable, and I have some flexibility around when, where, and how I work, that job fits into my life like a puzzle piece snapping into place. And that enhances my desire to join and stay. Where we have to be careful and understand this, Phil, is that those factors around workload and compensation, benefits, things like that, they have very little to do with effort. They have everything to do with retention, right? People join and stay when that ideal job factor is right. The other 2 factors, meaningful work and great boss, have dimensions to them as well. And we can unpack any one of these ideas that appeal to you, Phil. But meaningful work happens when employees do work that they see as having purpose, that aligns with their strengths, and on a team where they experience belonging, right? Purpose, strengths, and belonging makes work meaningful for employees. And that great boss factor, you know this, Phil, there are lots of things leaders have to get right for someone to point to them and say, man, I got a great boss. We think the 3 most important things are trust, coaching, and advocacy. So that's the model of really creating what we call a destination workplace. Having all of those experiences taking place consistently for employees checks the box next to each of those ideas on that internal psychological scorecard.
Awesome. Well, we're not going to have time to hit all of them, Joe, but let's take
Yeah.
one from each one. Let's start with meaningful work and let's talk about belonging, because
Yeah.
belonging is a big word, right? That I believe that's a capital B, belonging. We need to
Yeah.
be part of something greater than ourselves. So how do you define belonging, and how do we encourage that at work?
Yeah. And so there are a couple of ideas that live behind belonging. At a surface level, it's about connection and camaraderie, right? Do I like the people I work with? We've known for years, and Gallup especially has boatloads of research in this area, that people will actually forego a promotion or a new job elsewhere simply because they like the people they work with. And they don't want to leave that team. We know that has a high degree of influence. So connection and camaraderie matter, and we're seeing some of that in this moment too, where you're hearing about remote teams or some hybrid teams who are struggling a little bit with connection. We know it's a huge factor, but belonging goes beyond that. Belonging is really tied to inclusion. Am I an accepted and celebrated member of the team, not just for what I bring and what I contribute, but for who I am? And for the naturally occurring differences in the human condition. So, this is why so many organizations are finally committing to more diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And so much so now that that acronym, that popular DEI acronym, is now referred to by a lot of experts as DEIB. They're adding that belonging idea in there as well.
That's interesting. So if we rearrange the letters, maybe it's no longer biding our time, right? Instead, we're yeah doing something else. So okay, so I get that. That makes sense. So belonging, right? That's more than just saying though. Hey, here at work, we feel like a family, right?
Right. And some people don't want their workplaces to be a family. Families are complicated. Families have drama. I don't necessarily want that. Some people want to go to work and at the end of the day want to go be with not those people. And that's okay, right? But do I get to go to work and do I get celebrated and accepted for who I am? Do I look around and see people like me? Does my employer act in ways that make sure that my uniqueness and my humanity is encouraged? So, one thing that we talk about in depth in the book are what are called employee resource groups, which is where an organization is intentional in organizing opportunities for people who have certain things in common to connect with one another. So, for example, maybe in a tech company, you have a women in tech employee resource group, and that group helps make sure the organization is interviewing more women for certain kinds of positions, or at least giving opportunities for women to be involved in succession planning and get additional training. It's also keeping the organization honest about representation and about diversity to make that workplace more inclusive.
Awesome. Awesome. So meaningful work, get that one. Ideal job.
Mm,
Compensation, right, has to be good or better than average, I would argue, right? And I love how in the book you break down how it's got to be living wage, cost of living, all of that all has to be factored in. That
yeah.
was powerful. But with that, let's talk about the flexibility piece of that, Joe, because I
Okay.
think that's something that many organizations have more control over than less, and that is the flexibility.
Yeah. So, what we're getting wrong about this is we've very quickly associated the idea of flexibility with remote work. And yes, remote work is one of the most in demand workplace benefits around right now. In fact, even people in jobs that traditionally have no opportunity for remote work, think flight attendant, plumber, right? Landscaper. There are some jobs that you just can't do remote. Even folks in those roles are starting to expect that they should be able to do at least some of their work from home from time to time. Maybe that's continuing education. Maybe that's some administrative aspects of their job. But when we can create opportunities for that, we are giving people flexibility. The problem is that when we begin and end the conversation around flexibility with the idea of remote work, we're missing the point. Flexibility isn't about working from home, it's about autonomy. It's about having some influence and some choice over when, where, and how I work. So, when I advise organizations about creating more flexibility, which Phil is now the number one most requested workplace benefit in the world, more flexibility, what I advise them to think about is where can you give some power back to employees to make decisions about where, when, and how they work? Maybe it's the length of their shift, the days of their shift, their start times and end times, where they sit, who they work with, where they go, how often they travel. This does not need to be a massive reinvention of around how people work. It's just a giving back of some power to people so that they can tune into the times when they work best, for example, or when their schedule is the best fit for the rest of their life.
Well, and they can that continuing education. There's no reason you have to come into an office to watch a video any
Right.
longer. I
Right.
could watch it in 8 to 12 minute chunks, like you've got videos in the, Joe Mull and Associates, in your library there, which I love. Right, that's makes things super simple, and they can do 8 minutes here and 8 minutes there and 8 minutes there
Yep.
much more easily than maybe they can sit still for 2 hours when their job is always on their feet. Is that
Yeah.
where you're talking to?
Absolutely. And it's really about opening a dialogue with employees to say, we know flexibility is important to you, and we want to be the kind of workplace that meets the changing needs and values of a workforce. So let's put our heads together and come up with some ways or some policies or some pilots even that allow us to test drive some things while at the same time still ensuring that we're able to do business in the way that we need to do business. One of the things that ends up happening sometimes with flexibility is I work with a lot of medical practices and healthcare organizations, and I will hear a lot from practice managers who will say, I've given my team leads and front desk people a lot of flexibility. If I have a lot of moms who work here, and if their kid gets sick, they'll go and go pick up the kid and take the kid home and take the rest of the day off. Where we've tried to give them more flexibility, whereas in the past, maybe before they left work, they would try to call a neighbor or try to call the mother-in-law to jump in and help. And now that I've given them all this flexibility, it almost feels like they're taking advantage of it. And that's a legit concern. What has to happen is a dialogue between employees and leaders to say, here's what we can't have happening. How do we nip this in the bud? Because we don't want to take this away. Right. And so when you co create those kinds of policies together, you will get employees who will buy into the boundaries that you have to put in around how they work so that they don't jeopardize what they're getting.
Awesome. Boundaries matter, right? We have to set expectations, set those boundaries so we don't get taken advantage of. I think that's great advice. So, Joe, last piece here of the scorecard is the great boss. And many bosses think they're great, but you
Mm-hmm.
have actually 3 dimensions here that I love: coaching, trust, and advocacy. Let's talk
Right.
about advocacy because the other two seem pretty obvious to me.
Yeah. So when you think about what an advocate is, it's somebody who acts in someone else's best interests. And so advocacy is kind of the catch-all word that we use to talk about all the ways in which a direct supervisor acts in the best interests of their direct report. So this is everything from, do I not just care about the duties of their work, but their long-term career and where they want to go and what their goals are? That I don't just care about who they are at work or how they're feeling at work, but I care about their life outside of work. Do I at least know their story? I'm married, right? I'm single. I have parents that live with me that I take care of. I have kids, right? Do I know something about their story? I just moved here from a completely different part of the country. But advocacy is also about making sure that people have the material and the equipment and the information they need to do their jobs. And it's also making sure that we're shining a light on people rather than on ourselves as leaders, right? So it's the old adage of accepting blame for failure and giving credit for success. That's a part of advocacy as well. So it's all the ways in which we act in someone else's best interests.
So, Joe, people are going to get this and they're going to understand it. The book is awesome. So, what's holding organizations back from doing the kind of 9 dimensions here, from wrapping this employalty scorecard around their organization and doing it?
There are some myths and some perceptions that we have around some of the ideas that we're putting forth here, right? We've talked about 4-day work weeks and more flexibility, and there's a perception that that's really hard to pull off. We're talking about raising wages. There's a perception that that's really expensive. My advice is you have to choose your hard, right? You can run a business with low wages, minimum staffing thresholds, where you don't give people a lot of flexibilities, where you don't train leaders how to be great bosses. And the set of problems that you're going to have are going to be all related to turnover, to retention, to rehiring, retraining. You're going to have a lot of churn. And the people who are working there aren't going to be terribly dedicated to your customers, to quality, to safety, right? So you have a set of problems, of hard problems when you run a business that way. The things we're talking about here today are also hard to do, right? Make no mistake, that scorecard is not something you snap your fingers and have in 3 weeks. You have to be intentional about it. You have to think about the belief systems that you operate with as an employer. But When you get those things right, you actually get higher quality products and services. You get employees who stay longer. You get a higher level of commitment. You get a better customer experience. And so, yes, this is hard too, but this is the hard that results in all of the things that you got into business to do anyway, which was to make money, serve a community, do something for customers, and make a dent in the universe. So you have to choose your hard.
Ooh, that seems quite wise, Joe. Choose our hard. We can do that, right? We can choose that. So, with that, Joe, how do people get started along the journey? And I'm going to pause it here. I'm going to let you think about that answer
Mm.
because I think it's important, right? I think it's really important that you think about that. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to encourage folks to go get a copy of Joe's book. I want to encourage you go to employaltybook.com, employaltybook.com. Check it out. If you're looking for somebody besides Joe and I that says it's awesome, Ellenberg is halfway through it and he's loving it. So I encourage you to do that. Employalty is spelled Employalty book.com. So, Joe, how do folks get started on the Employalty journey?
It really comes down to starting with a simple question. If you're struggling to fill a certain position in your organization or keep people in a certain position in your organization, here's the question at the center of everything. How do we make this place the very best place to be a blank? A hostess, a server, a plumber, right? A medical assistant. If you're trying to find IT support people, if you're trying to hire teachers, what would make this place the very best place to be a teacher? When you turn the mirror inward and you start solving for what people are looking for and what we know keeps them fired up to do what they do at work, you end up not just creating an environment that becomes a destination workplace for people, but you create an extraordinary competitive advantage for yourself around hiring, around retention, and ultimately around how you serve whoever your customers are. So there's the question: what would make this place the best place to be a blank?
That is awesome. So, folks, answer that question for yourself. Get a copy of the book, get Employalty. Joe's got some great resources there that'll help you go even deeper into that. He's got the scorecard. It's about a 15-page PDF. You print it out, get to work on that, but absolutely go and get a copy of the book and get to know Joe Mull. Joe is dedicated to helping you be a great boss. He's dedicated to helping you build an organization that is worthy of Employalty. So thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for watching, for listening. As always, buddy, it's great to see you. Congratulations on a runaway bestseller. You the man.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me. This was fun.